Great. So thank you so much. This is an incredible lineup, and I'm thrilled to be a part of it and to share about a 4-year research project in 5 minutes is a bit of a challenge, but I'm going to do my best. So this is joint work with Philip Mulder, an outstanding PhD student here at the Wharton School. And, like a lot of my research, it's motivated by the fact that for most households, the house is their largest asset and their mortgage is their largest liability. And so when we're trying to understand household financial decision-making, it's really important to understand how households interact with the housing market and with the mortgage market, and in understanding how federal policy affects those two markets in particular. And so this project is going to be focused on the risk of sea level rise. And if we just start from sort of first principles here, about 30% of the US resides in a coastal county or coastal adjacent county. And climate forecasts are projecting growing risk of 6 feet of sea level rise, which would expose about $1 trillion of real estate to chronic inundation, meaning being regularly flooded, to say nothing of sort of more infrequent flooding, high tide flooding and storm surges and the like. And as we've learned about these forecasts and as they have amplified over time, in theory, we'd expect that house prices would react right away, that if the house price, if housing markets are forward-looking asset markets, then prices should immediately incorporate additional information regarding these types of risks. And so we were curious to find a setting where we could test this type of hypothesis. And the challenge is that there isn't a really clean experimental design. We didn't have anything as sharp and insightful as what Arthur is doing in terms of looking at his change in the postings or anything like a randomized control trial like Susanna. And so what we came up with instead was a strategy to look at different coastal communities in Florida, some of which are more low-lying and more exposed to sea level rise, others which have a slight bit more elevation, so are less exposed if the seas rise 6 feet. And so you can think about what I'm going to show you next as grouping two groups of communities, about 200 communities that are very exposed to sea level rise and about 200 communities that are less exposed. And we're going to bring in data from mortgage applications, about 2 million mortgage applications, about 1 million housing transactions, and about 1 million real estate listings to do this analysis just for Florida. What we find is shown here on the left, which is that if you look at these two different groups of coastal communities, they track each other very, very closely through the housing boom and bust of the 2000s in Florida. And then you see these two series start to diverge. And in particular, the areas that are more exposed to sea level rise, starting in 2013, see a decline in transaction volumes. So there are fewer homes trading hands starting in 2013, and this gap widens so that by 2019, prior to COVID, you see about a 20% gap between the more exposed communities and the less exposed communities. You see something a little bit different in the price series. The price series track each other quite well through the boom and bust, but if anything, prices recover more quickly coming out of the boom in these more exposed areas, the areas that are more likely to be flooded if seas do rise by 2100 to 6 feet of sea level rise. But it's only after a few years that you start to see this taper off. And now in 2019, you see a gap of about a 5 to 7% difference in prices. And so prices are still rising in both of these communities, but they're rising more slowly in the more exposed communities. So with this in mind, and I've sort of done the leap here where we leaped through about 3 years worth of data cleaning, data analysis, and data acquisition to put this together to start to understand what are the mechanisms here, what's going on in these housing markets, and why are we seeing these patterns. So I think 2013 was important for a number of reasons, a big one being Hurricane Sandy, which hit the East Coast. And in some additional analysis, we show that these effects are larger in the parts of Florida that have tighter connections in terms of migration patterns to the areas most affected by Hurricane Sandy. But this was also when the tone and the tenor of the news really changed, when you started to get much stronger waves of concern among reporters, among the national media, and among politicians about these changes, partly induced by the National Climate Assessment and the IPCC report that came out in 2013. So we think that represents a shift in awareness and a shift in beliefs in these local markets. And you can see this if you look across markets based on a separate data set for who's worried about climate change. And what we show is that these effects, both in terms of sales volume and in terms of house prices, are larger in the counties where more respondents are worried about climate change. So this seems like a function about awareness and information. We wanted to unpack these mechanisms further, and we thought, well, is this just about lenders adjusting their behavior? Is this about insurers adjusting their behavior? I don't have time to show you those results, but I want to show you how home buyers themselves responded. So the picture on the left is showing home seller behavior. So home sellers didn't change their behavior at all. They basically moved in lockstep across these two groups, continuing to list their homes and actually continued to list their homes at the same prices. But what we see is that a larger and larger share of those listings failed to sell. So the picture on the right is showing you the share of listings that didn't transact. So they expired in the MLS system. And what you see is that that grows over time until 2016, when we start to see a price adjustment. And so you start to see sellers reacting to this gradually. And so to put this all together, I think what we're seeing is some interesting frictions in the capitalization of new risk information. And we're showing the mechanisms through which that sort of percolates through the market as more informed buyers are less willing to pay essentially the asking price for properties in exposed coastal areas that are most vulnerable to sea level rise. So I will stop there, and thanks so much.